Within the list of the most horrific events the world has ever seen, natural catastrophes are earnestly marked as the most terrifying, and for good reason. Tornadoes, tsunamis, floods, fires, earthquakes, nothing comes close to the raw, uncalculating power and destruction that is taking the lives of tens of millions of people. Mother Nature at her very worst can be characterized as completely unhinged. When black swan catastrophes, like the aforementioned, happen, it's very difficult to compare it to anything more damaging to a nation's economy, infrastructure, markets, and business. It's events like these that make people wonder the physical damages a country must absorb to endure, to continue their lives and prosper as they were, even on an individual level. But what of the horrific events that are purposeful, that aim conflicts around the world, events in history books, events that sometimes involve many parts of the world, massively destructive times in history that are forced upon other nations by distortive means, to achieve ends that don't benefit everyone or every country? I'm talking about war. It's not a secret that war occurs for a variety of reasons. Since the dawn of time, conflict has been ingrained in every civilization. It's an unfortunate part of what makes humans human. There's just no way around that fact. Over the course of hundreds of years, the reasons for international and domestic conflict have shifted from land, religion, and resources. There's truly never been a single answer to why countries fight. And yet, every time this question is asked, there's always a different answer. However, with the US over the last 80 years, those reasons are getting smaller. And one single emphasis is becoming critically more important than all the others: money. I would like you to follow me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to convince you that the US military is actually a global business enterprise, and that spending, wars, and international conflicts have little to no effect on our markets. This is especially surprising when you discover that some of America's most powerful leaders are directly behind it, and why some might consider war good for the economy. To gain an understanding of the frame of reference I'm presenting, we only need to travel a short distance back in time to America's first war, or as most would say, our revolution. During the revolutionary conflict, America's interest was in becoming its own nation, to be able to govern itself and to be free to act as it so chooses. You could say its interest was to self-govern, and to declare itself independent. Now, the purpose of war then was self-defense, as a sovereign nation with the noblest intentions. The trophy for the greatest war of our history was independence. However, with the advancement of industrial and technological systems over the decades, military expenditures have grown into something completely different. Costs for maintaining a military and war efforts abroad have gone up exponentially, almost every year since our country's inception. And therein lies one of the big problems: spending. Now, it may not be well known, but military costs include expenditures that people wouldn't assume. This doesn't include the obvious, like contracts, personal salary, cost of equipment, transportation, vehicles, fighter jets, battleship carriers, weapons, ordnance and training, and equipment for military operations, food, supplies, procurement of materials to make those things, include retirement, pensions, social services, and now space branch activities, defense sector employees, governmental agencies, paramilitary force, operations and maintenance of military bases, military research and development, and military aid to other countries. Decades of technological development, trillions of dollars of improvements, years of expansion, the creation of newer and more advanced projects have led us to where we now stand today.
Space is a warfighting domain, just like the land, air, and sea. We may even have a space force.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
Probably some concern about other countries getting ahead of us. So you have to do what you have to do if your job is to protect the American people and to keep the military strong.
Yes.
You just have to operate with that premise that there's a bunch of other people out there that are doing the same thing for their country and trying to take down the United States, and we got to stay ahead of the curve and make human-eating robots that can shoot missiles.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Money that we don't have, and the money that our government is spending, and they don't have it either.
A willingness to self-govern has turned into a yearning power to influence others. The expansion and projection of our might has become an unfortunate cornerstone of American foreign policy. From this, a few questions do emerge. Who then dictates military expenditures? Why hasn't the economy crashed after so much conflict and war spending? Who benefits from all this, and how? As it turns out, I found the answers to most of these questions, and I must admit the results are rather frightening. As most would assume, America is known for a lot of things. one of them being its military spending. The sheer amount is staggering. At around $780 billion, this is 38% of the global total, which is around 3.7% of our GDP. But how is that created and where does that come from? The DoD, or the Department of Defense, is the umbrella department that oversees all executive functions and agencies that the United States uses for national security. It's comprised of members that concern interest of national defense. They keep several board members who are elected by the president. The chief among them is this person. They might not look familiar by themselves, but put their image next to the government official that sits directly above them to gather the importance of this position. Many don't know this, but the military budget is actually approved by the Senate Armed Services Committee. This agency actually has the power of legislative oversight over the Department of Defense and other matters related to defense policy. It is considered the most powerful Senate committee for all things military. Now, it's critically important to understand these points because it serves as a backdrop to the entire video. Much like other nations, the federal government collects taxes to finance various public services. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, is protection of its citizens. You see, policymakers and citizens weigh key decisions about revenues and expenditures. It is important to examine what the government does with the money it collects. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the military defense occupies 13% of the federal budget, which is the third largest spending category behind healthcare insurance and Social Security. But the 13% does include benefits for veterans, which sits at around 7%. This is yet eclipsed by the fact that the military spending is larger than the next 10 largest spending countries combined, by $25 billion. It's clear from a top-down viewpoint that investment to all things military become inexorably complex and bureaucratic, from funding, spending, enactments, legislation, bills, laws, regulations. It's almost as if the defense of this nation is a business into itself, which brings us to the money side of the equation. It's no secret that America's conflicts have yielded some interesting results, from the War of Independence to the involvement in the Russian-Ukraine issue. See, in history, countries have literally ruined their economy and reputation by implementing a military-first, occupation-style foreign policy, even as a state-issue type of domestic policy. The chief examples herein include the German occupation in the 1940s, and now the North Koreans, as well as a few African and Middle Eastern territories. It was mentioned by the DoD and the State Department that since 2002, the cost of military expenditures for overseas operations hit almost $2 trillion. Now, if we examine that point even further, we can identify a more interesting trend. The future cost of war on terror, up to 2056, has been forecasted to reach $13.5 trillion. On the surface, it appears that the US has a spending issue. And if you guessed that, you certainly wouldn't be wrong. But something remarkable to point out is that despite overemphasis on military expenditures, the growth of the military is checked quite extensively. You certainly don't have to look very far to hear the famous phrase, military-industrial complex. This topic has been written about extensively and researched and covered by dozens of writers, academics, and governmental officials over the years. In essence, the military-industrial complex is the special relationship between a country's military operational command and the defense industry that supplies it, often citing a mutual relationship between the two, between makers of weapons of war and the politicians who implement and mandate the policy that creates them. When I dove headfirst into reading publications and statistical data about war expenditures and the military complex, I expected to see futuristic images of war-torn countries, collapsing infrastructure, and endless supply of data, given a clear relationship between military-first spending and economies. A place where this captivating anti-war narrative repeatedly tells us we're headed. There's just one tiny problem. There wasn't and were not. I was largely driven to data citing comparisons with other countries. The world, Russia, China, and our allies. Congress passing this bill or spending X amount of money. On and on and on. Except there is an answer. One simple data point that people don't talk about. The one that provided an answer mathematically to the question. And that is military spending to GDP. Perhaps the clearest and salient example to a complex question. We are growing as a nation, despite rising costs on military with year-over-year increases. Military complex or not, the numbers don't lie. Since the 1960s, the US defensive spending has increased exponentially. That much is true. But that's only half the equation. The spending and deficit don't matter too much because of growth over time. If we glance at the graph once more, we notice a trend of billions of dollars of growth, and a decrease of military spending relative to the growth. If we take this example a little further, we can deduce that from 1995 to 2020, military spending has averaged only about 4%, relatively speaking. Another angle to consider is what happens to the economy during wars. Doesn't it negatively affect the impacts of markets in the short and long term? World War II broke out officially in 1939, and with it, an international conflict so massive, it took the lives of 70 million people, give or take depending on who you're asking. The war lasted 6 years, involved 30 countries, and is forever marked as the biggest event in world history. One would assume it would have a massive negative effect on the markets, across the globe, especially the US. Well, not as much as you would think. But why is that? I managed to locate an interesting chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We begin to notice something remarkable the more we look at it. As one example, the US officially entered World War II in 1941, when the Empire of Japan bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The one-day drawdown on that attack moved the S&P 500 by 3.8%, total drawdown at around 20, which took 5 months to hit bottom. By the end of World War II, the total gain for the S&P 500 market was around 30%. Even in the years leading to the end of World War II, the market produced double-digit gains year over year. If you would have guessed that seeing a declaration of war streaming across newspapers, sources listing out casualties, and businesses ceasing operation would have disastrous implications on the economy, you would be wrong. Yet this is only one example of this phenomenon I'm mentioning. Even in World War I, from 1914 to 1918, produced a net positive in the Dow Jones. The Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975 produced a net neutral return, despite lack of popularity. Even the Iraq War produced the exact same thing, a net neutral position. As I discovered, there are a few good reasons for the markets to react this way. Firstly, it's psychological. If you think about it for a second, America has been through some rough markets. Crashes, dips, recessions, meltdowns, cool-offs, corrections, we've made it through all of it. There is this belief that there's no such thing as a bottomed out market. Such is the case with every single crash, conflict, and war America's had. Society has grown accustomed to plugging away with business, regardless of what might happen nationally or abroad. The same is true during war times and with defensive spending. Our vulnerability has become smaller and smaller over time. Case in point, look at any market chart showing major market falls and corrections over the last 120 years. We see the Great Recession, the dot-com bust, the 2008 housing sell-off, and recently the Corona crash, all of which we have recovered from. This has been true for the dawn of time. It solidifies opinions and moves people, including markets, in one direction. Sociologically speaking, wars bring people together unlike any other thing. In the US academic circles, this is actually called a rally around the flag effect. What this means is that when a nation has a major conflict, people put aside their ideological differences and support the nation's major effort at the time. This also includes collective spending. As an example, during the initial stages of World War II, consumer spending dropped sharply as the US switched to a more serious domestic wartime effort. Instead of producing cars and appliances, factories produced tanks, guns, airplanes, ammo, supplies. Even domestic agriculture and healthcare were consumed at a higher rate. What this means is that during a war, the stock market switches from normal consumption to producing heavy amounts of basic essentials. Wartime products and emphasis on consumer spending is put into overdrive. This movement, of course, is reflective in the economy. Lastly, we come full circle, revealing one of the most important components of this entire video. We have contract investments. I'm not suggesting this last point is solely responsible for any economic turnaround or deficit, but it's very difficult to ignore. As I mentioned earlier, the military is becoming a political company. If it is in fact a global business, who then profits from it? Over several decades, the defensive sector has emerged in international markets and provides a logical backbone tying in all things that touch the military. That is the private defense contract companies. What most people don't realize is that these corporations that support the military are publicly traded companies who employ tens of thousands of workers. That means mutual funds, banks, hedge funds, traded accounts have the option of directly investing into these businesses and reap the rewards of a massive governmental contract they are projected to receive. During times of war and uncertainty, large capital injections into private businesses will tend to lead to market correction and stabilization, despite global confrontation and economic turmoil. This is where the US officials play an interesting role. I managed to come across an incredibly well-written article by several authors of The Insider, a global news publication. The article highlights the relationships between military contractors, defensive policy lawmakers, and the investments they hold. Now, of course, I can't paraphrase the entire article, but it makes the case that there should be more oversight into lawmakers who hold powerful positions over military policy, and that have financial ties to defensive contractors. As stated by the article, whether they have leadership positions on the committees or not, all lawmakers who have made investments in the defensive industry all sit on the House and Senate panels, responsible for writing the annual defense budget authorization bill and bankrolls the military personnel and subcontractors into their home districts. As an example, Representative of California Ro Khanna's wife reportedly had private investments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars into Honeywell, an aerospace company, in 2021. Despite his attempts to rebuff these comments, the Khanna's family investments also include Boeing, General Dynamics, GE, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. Now let me make this clear. The issue here isn't investments into defensive military companies, as all large portfolios will have some exposure to these types of businesses. The issue is that Mr. Khanna sat on the Armed Services Committee during this time. And he's not the only one. Representative Jim Cooper of Tennessee had $65,000 of General Electric, and he sits on the Strategic Armed Forces Committee during that time. Even Representative Pat Fallon, buying and selling $1.4 million of Boeing stock and $50,000 of General Electric. Representative Senator Tommy Tuberville owning $200,000 of Honeywell and Lockheed Martin, General Electric, and General Dynamics and Raytheon combined. The publication does dig deeper into both House and Senate investments and uncovers a lack of knowledge when it comes to conflict of interest. What this is essentially is pouring salt in an obvious wound of too much spending and making it much worse. For the general population out there, there's an understanding that professional overlay of connections and conflicts of interest need to be addressed before someone takes a position or sits on the board of a defense company. If I had to aim a pointer finger at anything related to the military-industrial complex, that is exactly where I would start. I'll close out this video by stating a few important points. When writing for this, I was shocked by how everything was interconnected to each other. Policymakers, laws, bills, spending, and how complex and political this problem actually is. Now, I'll admit, there's a lot at play here. Most surprising to me was how markets react to war efforts. Perhaps that's because of the public's perception of our defensive business. It's shocking how much we've grown militarily as a country, the technological advancements and growth of the defense budget. Now, let me be clear in saying we need the American military, the research, the development, and protection. But I'm afraid it's turned into a grab for money and not a quest for upholding values and democracy. The complex has turned into something gaudy and shameful, while leaving the American public with the bill. On the opposite side of my opinion, it's challenging to say anything that isn't controversial. The Javelin missile system helped Ukraine push back Russian forces, as Russian troops invaded into sovereign territory, destroying buildings and families in their wake. A perfect example to this video is that I can't find it logical to blame Lockheed Martin for the system's invention, or the bill that an American taxpayer has to pay for its creation. But I am thankful for the use of it, as it does save lives and adds a defensive shield for good. I've discovered that the US economy is solely based on confidence, as it is also at the core of the military business, and subsequently answered to most of my questions when making this video. It is confidence that very few countries have as a resource. Fortunately, consumers and investors see the US as reliable. Same for our research and development of military systems, and ones that we sell to countries that need them. I believe this is why the US doesn't seem to falter in the growth area, even during times of war. I'm not gonna lie, the US debt has reached dangerous levels, and that's not about to change. But the public remains confident that the debt will be repaid. But perhaps that's another video for a later discussion. As we move forward collectively, let us hope that the products of defensive corporations and the policymakers connected to them remember where we came from as a nation and what we aspire to be. But perhaps that's just me being hopeful or confident. And I'm gonna leave it right there for you guys. If you liked the video, you already know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.